unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grand Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan Vaishnav. In India today, so many political debates are focused on welfare and welfarism. It seems that state after state is competing to offer the most electorally attractive benefits to its voters. The central government, for its part, has pioneered a new model of social welfare built around digital identification and direct cash transfers to needy households. Making India Work, The Development of Welfare in a Multi-Level Democracy is a new book by the scholar Louise Tillin. It examines the development of India's welfare state over the last century, from the early decades of the 20th century to the present. In so doing, it recovers a history previously relegated to the margins of scholarship on the political economy of development. Louise is a professor of politics in the King's India Institute at King's College London. She is one of the world's leading experts on Indian federalism, subnational comparative politics, and social policy. She's the author or editor of several previous books, including Remapping India, New States and Their Political Origins. To talk more about her new book, I am pleased to welcome Louise to the show for the very first time. Louise, congrats on the book, and thanks for taking the time.
Thanks so much, Milan. It's a great honor to be here.
So I want to start by asking you about the origin story of this book. As you write in the introduction, you were sort of sitting, watching, traveling to India, changes that the Congress Party-led UPA government undertook to welfare policy in that decade or so period between 2004 and 2014. And at some point, you kind of had this eureka moment that you needed to kind of go back in time and tell the entire story of kind of India's, evolution of its welfare regime, as you call it. Tell us a little bit about kind of, what prompted that moment and what it spurred you to do.
Yeah, thanks, Milan. So, the origins of this book go way back. I've been thinking about it for over a decade, and really, actually, since I suppose I was doing the fieldwork for my PhD, which was now, going on 20 years ago, which was in the kind of very early stages of the implementation of some of the UPA's flagship welfare programs. So things like the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. And at that stage, I was really interested in why new states formed, but I was also increasingly interested in how states were inheriting policies that were designed at the centre and then implementing and then making them their own at the state level. And that led into, after I finished my PhD, a phase of new work with colleagues, my colleagues Rajeshwari Deshpande and KK Kailash and others within the Lokniti network, trying to trace the politics of social policy at the state level. And another project looking at the politics of poverty reduction under the UPA, trying to look at the origins of or the political origins, what had made possible this new phase of rights-based social welfare legislation. And as I was working on these two projects, and with I suppose a lot of interest in this period in what appeared to be a pretty seismic shift in the way that the Indian state thought about welfare, the advent of the so-called rights-based approach, which sought to build accountability and state capacity to do welfare by empowering poor people to understand their entitlements and ask the state to meet and deliver those entitlements. And great outpouring of scholarship that looked at this rights-based approach, that hailed its great potential to transform the Indian welfare. It was to transform welfare into something that looked more like a welfare state in India, in which social welfare became a right of citizenship rather than something that was bestowed through, as a form of patronage to a more passive citizenry. But as I wrote about the politics of this period myself, it became really clear to me that we didn't really know very much about the longer-term historical origins of what already went for social policy in India. So, for instance, India has a pretty well-protected formal sector, what we now know as a formal sector workforce, that are covered by forms of contributory, what social policy experts call social insurance. So things like sickness insurance that provide benefits and paid leave to workers when they're sick, also provident funds. And these forms of social protection for formal sector workers have indeed even come to define what we understand as the contours of the formal sector and the informal sector workforce. And yet there were no studies which explained to us why India had come to erect these series of social policies for one set of workers and of course not others. So, this was a period when there was growing understanding, among political scientists that, for all the focus on varieties of welfare capitalism, different types of welfare state that had emerged in the post-Second World War context in Europe and to some extent in North America, that there were also patterns that we needed to understand better in countries in the global South. And it seemed to me pretty conspicuous that there was no serious history of welfare in India. So that was the original idea for this book. It's taken a very long time to actually research and write it, but that's what got me started.
So in the introduction of the book, you call India's welfare regime precocious. And we've heard this term precocious democracy thrown around before. It's something that Devesh Kapoor and Arvind Subramanian have talked about. It features into their new book on the political economy of India's development. And I sort of, in my mind, assume the two are linked. How is India's distinct political evolution, on the one hand, responsible, do you think, for the precocious nature of its welfare regime?
Thanks, Melissa. Yeah, interesting question that. And actually, even though the book, in lots of ways, is concerned with how the nature of India's democracy has shaped its welfare system, when I describe India's welfare regime as being somewhat precocious in certain respects in the introduction, I'm actually talking about a certain kind of precocity that really is related to how India bucks what we might have expected at certain historical junctures for a country facing the challenges of economic development that India was. So the first is in the 1940s, when even before India has finished drafting its constitution, and barely a year after it became independent from colonial rule, it legislates on a form of sickness insurance for industrial workers, and it does so before major world economies like the United States or Canada, indeed, have been able to introduce forms of health insurance. Countries that, like India, were governed by forms of decentralized political institutions, which created lots of obstacles for the negotiation of social security. And of course, India does that, or the building blocks for doing that are constructed in a context of colonialism. So that's the first element of precocity. And the second element is it refers to another period of political and economic transition in India, that of economic liberalization, where I show in the book that unlike many other developing countries who faced structural adjustment somewhat earlier than India, India doesn't see the retrenchment of social policies that we see in other countries in those processes of social of economic liberalization. So those are the ways in which I think there's something precocious about the nature of welfarism, which I think is slightly different actually to the way we might think of its democracy as being precocious.
Louise, I just want to pull together a couple of things which you've said so far, right? The first is that you embarked on this project because you felt like there hadn't been a comprehensive history of kind of the evolution of India's kind of welfare regime. And then just picking up on what you just said, it's kind of ironic given that there were these two world historical moments, the kind of post-war era, the post-liberalization era, when India actually did something unexpected, or, some would say maybe out of the box. And you write in the book that despite all of India's significance in terms of size, scale, its contributions to development theory in so many ways, it hasn't really been closely scrutinized as a distinctive welfare regime. Now, you've been studying this, for quite some time, and I wonder if you have any thoughts on what might account for this neglect.
Yeah, so I think there are a number of reasons that have led to the neglect. I think that possibly the most important is that India itself appeared to have downgraded the significance of social and economic rights in the process of constitution making. So the very fact that social and economic rights found their way into the so-called directive principles of the Indian constitution, which are the non-justiciable parts at the outset of the constitution, rather than the justiciable fundamental rights, appeared to suggest that social and economic rights had been downgraded as a founding principle of the Indian constitution after independence. And then I think added to that, there had been the all pretty pervasive assumption that developing countries needed to do development first before they could embark on the task of building a welfare state. That welfare states were something that emerged at a certain point of economic development, and thus it would be there wouldn't be much point to looking for the origins of a welfare state in India because it hadn't reached that stage of development. Now, going back to my answer just now about India's precocity, what I show in this book is that actually at earlier stages of economic development, India was creating the foundational moments in a welfare state story that have absolutely shaped the nature of its welfare regime today. So we do have to look back to those earlier stages of a development process in order to understand why it has the kind of welfare state that it does. And I think the other reason why most scholarship on India's political economy has tended to ignore welfare as a domain in which the state intervenes in the operations of market forces is because of the kind of abiding preoccupation with clientelism and the assumption that all public policy in India and in other contexts of development is by its nature its purposes are by their nature subverted due to the preeminence of clientelism as the mode in which a state distributes goods to its citizens. And so I think that interest in clientelism has also overshadowed an interest in the content of public policy, and in this case, in particular, welfare policy. So you find very, very little mention of welfare, if indeed any, in what I would consider to be the great studies of India's political economy.
I mean, before we kind of get into the heart of the substance of the book, I just want to ask you a bit about method, because when you're talking about the kind of plan of the book, you note that this book draws on a wealth of archival materials, some of which have been newly declassified, never seen before, never used before. I wonder if you could just unpack that for us. Tell us a little bit about the material that you uncovered when doing research for this book.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, this was a really fun project to research because the archival work took me all over the place. And I should say it took me all over the place, but I also worked with 3 really superb research assistants who helped me with different parts of the archival work. But it took me from the kind of the dusty state archives in Maharashtra, where I uncovered, these fascinating files about the debates about how sickness insurance should be implemented in the state after it had been legislated on, through to early on in the project discovering the digitized archives of the International Labour Organization, which the University of Göttingen had recently digitized, which were an absolute goldmine for also tracing the early stages of labour policy, through to archival materials in the India Office Library, in the British Library in the UK, kind of real gems, for instance, in papers of the War Cabinet from the Second World War, places I never expected to see debates about Indian social policy, but there they were. The private papers of Sir William Beveridge, who also has an interesting walk-on role in the history of social policy in India. The archives of the World Bank, using material that had been newly declassified on the early years of liberalisation. Private papers of industrialists, of a really important bureaucrat, S. Guhan, an IAS officer from Tamil Nadu who was instrumental in designing social policy in Tamil Nadu in the late 1980s, but also some of the national social assistance policies in the mid-1990s. His private papers, I think, also had never been used before, but were sitting there in Teen Murti, now the Prime Minister's museum and library in Delhi. So a real variety of both, government records, both in India and in Britain, but also private papers and organisations like the ILO and the World Bank.
I want to give our listeners a bit of a sense of the kind of scope, because you really do trace the evolution of the welfare state from its origins, in fact, in pre-colonial India to the current day. On this question of origins, you write that the adoption or establishment of a kind of national architecture of Social Security is best understood in the context of the growing pressures to regulate interprovincial competition, particularly industrial competition, in the late colonial period. And I'm wondering if you just take us back in time and tell us a little bit about, what those forces were that gave birth to the Indian welfare regime, because I don't think these are very well known.
Sure. Yeah. So this is one of my favourite parts of the book. It's the first part of the book. The book starts in the setting of a colonial Bombay in the 1920s, just after the end of the First World War, a time when the textile industry in Bombay was under growing pressure from, let's just take a further step back to think the textile industry was one of India's two leading economic sectors in the colonial period. Textiles with their epicenter in Bombay, and jute was centred in Calcutta. And what I suggest in the first part of the book is that we need to understand the context of Bombay and the particular challenges facing textile industry in Bombay in order to understand the origins of social policy. So in a nutshell, we have what was once a flourishing textile industry, increasingly under pressure from newer entrants to the textile markets in all over India, from further afield in Bombay Presidency to Kanpur to much smaller centres of textile manufacturing. And these newer upcountry mills were putting more pressure on employers in Bombay because they were unable to undercut Bombay in terms of the cost of labour. And so employers in Bombay facing growing industrial unrest in the city, and along with provincial administrators and moderate labour leaders, start to explore some of the forms of social policy that are being debated in the International Labour Organization, for instance, of which India is one of the founding members. And we see a growing interest in the course of the 1920s and 1930s in experimenting with forms of social policy that might help to stabilise a more stabilise an industrial working class in Bombay, especially to support workers in periods of sickness and ill health, which would traditionally have been times when workers would leave their workplace and go back to their villages because that would be their only source of support while they were ill. We see an interest in the city, particularly moderate labour leaders such as N.M. Joshi, thinking coming from the ILO and to some extent within the provincial administration in studying the appropriateness of these forms of sickness insurance for Bombay. And these ideas are picked up also by the Royal Commission for Labour in India in the early 1930s, which recommends that India should adopt a form of sickness insurance. But the reason why I put so much emphasis in the first part of the book on the importance of the national architecture for social security was that it was very difficult for Bombay on its own to start to introduce social policy, because these forms of social insurance would place costs on employers in Bombay that would further increase the costs of labour for them, and so disadvantage them in their competition with these newer textile mills in other parts of the country. So by the eve of the Second World War, there is both growing momentum behind the need for some form of sickness insurance, but concern from Bombay, the leading, the heart of India's textile industry, that it can't go it alone, and that there needs to be national coordination around social security in order effectively to place a floor on labour market competition. And this is something which gets pushed forward in the context of the Second World War, and most importantly by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who becomes member for Labour on the Viceroy's Executive Council in the wake of the Quit India movement in 1942, which is really where we see the compromises being forged that then paved the way for the legislating on sickness insurance in 1948. So this is the first meaning of the book's title, Making India Work. I suggest that what's happening in this period is a debate about how you regulate interprovincial competition in order to create a national economy. So it is making India work as a national economy.
There is this assumption in the literature that you point out that variation in the welfare choices or the welfare regimes of developing countries is related to the choice of their post-war economic development model, right? So if they chose a kind of import substitution industrialization model, that would lead them down one welfare path. If they chose instead a kind of export-led industrial model, that would lead them somewhere different. What's interesting is you write that India's introduction of a contributory model of kind of sickness insurance, right, of health insurance, was consolidated during World War II, well before the introduction of import substitution, which came much later. Did that timing surprise you as you were kind of going through the archives?
Yes, it did, because of the few explanations we've had for why India has ended up with a protected formal sector workforce. The main explanation has been that India, like countries in Latin America, for instance, which also have strong forms of social insurance for their formal sector workforce, that these were countries that adopted import substituting models of industrialization, and that ISI, so to speak, shielded employers from external competition, such that the state could ask them to take on additional costs to subsidise workers, these forms of contributory social insurance, in return for tariff protections and protections from external competition. So the idea that this form of welfare model was bound up with ISI. So indeed, that's what I expected to find when I first embarked on this project. But actually, to my surprise, the story well predates the advent of ISI. And now we could argue that ISI enables this system to survive and entrenches it, but it doesn't tell us much about the origins.
Hey, Grant Tamasha listeners. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grant Tamasha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out. I mean, you also spend a great deal of the book, talking about the kind of Nehruvian model of development and the Nehruvian vision of an advanced capital-intensive sector that would, kind of proceed alongside a lower productivity, mass-employing household sector. And you say that the prioritization kind of the former ruled out the large-scale extension of a welfare state, at least in those early stages of planning. And I guess my question to you is, when you go back and kind of read the contemporaneous accounts, were India's leaders aware of the risks of that kind of capital-intensive, heavy industry approach at the time?
Yeah, this is, another really interesting question that fascinated me, really, which was, another way to think about that is that there's quite a disjuncture at independence. So, I've just talked about the birth of one way of doing welfare, which is a model of contributory social insurance, which could have been, and indeed its proponents at the time thought it might be, the kernel of a more universal welfare state, such that as more workers are drawn into a burgeoning, industrial sectors, that they too would be covered by forms of social security, and that therefore, you would see an expanding welfare state. And instead, what happened, especially from the India's second 5-year plan onwards, with a very deliberate strategy that India's planners adopted to favour capital-intensive rather than labour-intensive industrialisation. And that decision meant that right at its outset, India ends up with a very, very truncated welfare state, if you like, which protects only a tiny number of workers in the formal sector. We're talking 6-8% of all workers, and excludes the mass of the Indian workforce or potential workforce from its purview. And this was quite deliberate. So I show in the second part of the book that Nehru and P.C. Mahalanobis, the architect of the second 5-year plan, were deliberately seeking to create a model of industrialization that, in Mahalanobis's words, would protect an island of high productivity in a capital-intensive sector that would, by its very nature, be low employing. So this would be a sector that would deploy the most advanced technologies and machines, even at the expense of employment. So the growth engine of the Indian state was not to be the growth engine of employment. And because of that decision, it was also not going to be the growth engine of a welfare state. And instead, Nehru and Mahalanobis make the quite conscious decision that you need to think of the welfare state quite differently for most Indians who would sit outside of that capital-intensive sector, and so the kind of the logic of thinking about welfare really bifurcated at that moment.
But there was a kind of attempt that came later to try and kind of redress what was going on in rural India, right? I mean, if you have early on this bias in India's welfare policy focus on urban workers, that began to change, particularly after the Green Revolution, right? You write that during that period in Indian history, you started to see these kind of multi-level political realignments take place, propelled in part by the Green Revolution, that sort of gave rise to the first expansion of India's welfare regime into rural areas. I wonder if we could just focus on for a second, how that process played out. Why was the Green Revolution such an inflection point as it relates to welfare development?
So you have to think of where when and where the Green Revolution comes from. So in the early 1960s, we have a crisis of planning. The early gains in terms of industrial growth have tailed off. We have famine. We have a context in which India is not able and has never been able to produce enough food grains to feed its own population. You have a kind of crisis in the rural economy. So the Green Revolution then is a crucial intervention in reorienting the nature of the rural economy and putting the agrarian economy on a completely different path than it had been on for the preceding 15, 20 years after independence. But the consequences in terms of inequality and political relationships in rural areas are really profound. So by kickstarting a form of agrarian capitalism through investment in new forms of rural technological interventions, seed varieties, irrigation infrastructures, and so on, you start to see the prying apart of older patron-client ties that bound landless labourers and landowners into relationships of reciprocity in which landless labourers depended on rural patrons for some degree of informal social security when times were hard. But with the emergence of a new class of owner-cultivator farmers, those forms of patron-client ties start to weaken quite dramatically. And you have what scholars like Jan Bremen, working in South Gujarat in the early 1970s, described as new forms of pauperization emerging, in which landless labourers were increasingly ghettoized in parts of the village, and shorn of the old relationships that supported them in hard times. You also have, of course, the consequences of a capital-intensive rather than labour-intensive model of industrialisation, which means that there isn't an engine of industrialisation that is drawing surplus labour from rural areas into urban areas. And so in this context, you have some really important studies that were conducted, such as the Ford Foundation work of Dandekar and Nath on really mapping rural poverty and inequality in painstaking detail for the first time, and drawing attention to what was increasingly explicitly recognised as a crisis of both underemployment but also unemployment in rural areas that required new forms of state intervention. So the need to design social security or social policy interventions for the rural sector stemmed in part from the decisions that were made about India's model of industrialisation, but also was prompted by the disruptive consequences of the Green Revolution. And of course, all which that did to the nature of electoral competition, political competition at the time as well.
This is a really nice segue, I think, into thinking about the kind of variation in state models of welfarism. And I think, going back to the politics, you start to see, particularly in the 1960s, the decline of the Congress Party, particularly in India states. That leads to the rise of caste-based, of regional parties, which, of course, gather steam until in 1989, of course, you have this inflection point where we welcome in a period of 25 years of coalition rule at the center. But if you kind of go back to, by the end of the 1980s, we're starting to see in clearer terms these different models and the contours of these different models, right? So on the one hand, you have this kind of promotional model of welfarism, which you attribute to a state like Maharashtra, which had bequeathed the employment guarantee scheme, which ended up being taken up later as the national rural employment guarantee scheme at the center. But you also had a very different model in the southern state of Tamil Nadu, which you call a more protective model of Social Security. And I wonder if you could just kind of pause for a second and help us understand those two ends of the spectrum, right? I mean, what do those terms, promotional in Maharashtra and protective in Tamil Nadu, mean? And how do you kind of, characterize those two kind of welfare regimes?
Yeah, thanks. So a promotional approach, which, as you say, was the kind of the preeminent approach in the aftermath of the Green Revolution, both in Maharashtra, but actually also nationally from the 1970s, with a whole set of different food for work and national rural employment programs, not guarantee programs at the national level at that stage. These promotional programs really focus on employment generation as a route to longer term poverty reduction. And what they didn't do was to provide a form of social safety net, if you like, of the kind that formal sector workers enjoyed due to social insurance, which insured them against the contingent risks of, different things that happen at different stages of your life. So, the idea of a welfare state existing in order to protect you at times when you fall ill, when you get old, when you have children and need to step out of the workforce. So the things that, interrupt your ability to sell your labour in the marketplace. And for most Indian workers working in the informal sector, India in this period had no form of social protection that was available to people who either couldn't work or those who did work but who didn't secure a sufficiently stable wage in order to support their households. So the idea of protective needing to build the protective dimensions of social policy was really something that started to take shape in Tamil Nadu quite conspicuously by the mid to late 1980s. And it owed a lot both to the individual I mentioned earlier, S. Guhan, whose private papers I've used in researching the later parts of the book, and who was a Tamil Nadu IAS cadre bureaucrat. Who did a lot of the thinking around protective social policy, but it also owed a lot to the evolving nature of the regional political landscape in Tamil Nadu and the forms of paternalistic populism that were developing there. So the long-running midday meal program in Tamil Nadu, but which was also added to in the 1980s with new forms of old age pensions for informal sector workers, maternity allowances, welfare schemes targeted at informal sector workers. The extension of different areas of national welfare legislation targeted to informal workers in Tamil Nadu. So it was really those protective dimensions which were easier to sell, if you like. I mean, this, and I suggest in the later chapter of the book, this is the origins of the direct benefits story that we're now so familiar with in India today. The direct transfer of immediate benefits to people packaged through, competing electoral platforms by parties in the regional arena. And that was really, honed in Tamil Nadu, and also, adopted in different ways, especially by other southern states in the, now we're kind of moving into post-liberalisation, but in the early years after liberalisation as well.
Just speaking of liberalization, I want to kind of bring the story up to that point, but also maybe come back to something you said at the beginning, which is, many people might have expected, seeing this market opening in 1991, that the focus on deregulation, on privatization, on welcoming foreign investment, on lowering taxes, getting rid of kind of industrial licensing might have displaced the welfare agenda, right? I mean, there's a pretty rich kind of quote unquote kind of markets agenda there, but you actually find, and you alluded to this earlier, quite the opposite, that in many ways liberalization in 91 pushed social policy further up the political agenda rather than marginalizing it. And I wonder if you could help us understand, why it had that impact.
So this is another one of my favorite bits of the story.
It's like talking about your children, right? I mean, this was my favorite. Then I had this.
Exactly. Forgive me if I fall too deep down this particular rabbit hole, but just indulge me for a minute. So one of the many threads that were left hanging by the 1960s. I have to step back for a minute. By the 1960s, when we think about the development of social policy for the formal sector, was the failure to agree a mechanism for unemployment insurance. So workers in the formal sector had access to sickness insurance. They had provident funds, which were a form of savings account for old age. And they had accrued rights against retrenchment. So initially, in the 1960s, workers gained the right to be compensated by employers if their jobs were cut. And then, due to an amendment of the Industrial Disputes Act during the emergency in 1976, They also gained even stronger rights against retrenchment, which made it very difficult for large firms to lay off workers. Now, this particular provision, in the absence of unemployment, a form of unemployment insurance, came back to bite the government hard after economic liberalisation, when seeking to restructure unprofitable public sector enterprises and large firms in the wake of economic liberalisation. The government needed to, and was under pressure from organisations like the World Bank, to reform its labour legislation in order to make it easier for workers to hire and fire workers. And this question of the need for a so-called exit policy became a focal point for opponents of the reforms. So those who argued that economic reforms were being conducted in ways that were harmful to the interests of Indian workers and were likely to increase poverty and vulnerability. And so having initially tried to push full steam ahead with crafting an exit policy, and having agreed a loan from the World Bank, a social sector adjustment loan from the World Bank that was intended to support the creation of something called a national renewal fund that would have helped introduce a kind of unemployment insurance for workers who were laid off. Having done all of this, the political heat around the exit policy became so great, and this was the subject of a no confidence motion in Narasimha Rao's government in 1992, that the government decided quietly to step back from pushing the idea of an exit policy and from pushing ahead with labour law reforms, and instead negotiated with the World Bank to convert the adjustment loan that was intended to enable labour law legislation. Instead, this was redirected in order to support existing social policies. So this would include the National Rural Employment Scheme, which existed by this stage, not the subsequent National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, the public distribution system, for subsidised food, and primary education and primary health care. And the World Bank files are fascinating as well, because you can see that World Bank officials were really nervous about doing this, because it led them into, rather than a loan which was intended to support a shared policy goal of the World Bank, it led them into really supporting poor social expenditure of the government of India at a time when it was also trying to push India, to reform social expenditure. In order to kind of fulfill a program of fiscal consolidation. So this is why I kind of say this was quite precocious, because India, even though there is a slight falling off in social expenditure in the initial phases of economic liberalisation, this only lasts a couple of years, and then it really starts to pick back up. And what you see then in the course of the 1990s is that as the central government does see to do, to introduce targeting. This is where the origins of the below poverty and above poverty line categorization for PDS food grains and the introduction of what was then called the targeted public distribution system. So as it does try to introduce targeting, as it slightly shifts the burden of supporting the public distribution system onto consumers rather than farmers, it's state governments that start to pick up the slack, and this is where you really start to see the consolidation of multi-level electoral competition over welfare, the kinds of the thing that we're very used to seeing in India today, with state governments often governed by different parties to those in power at the centre, competing to offer different forms of benefit to voters. In this period in the 1990s, it was offered different ways of packaging offers of subsidised food grains, that were at the heart of this kind of competition. So it's for those two reasons. It's the failure to negotiate an exit policy, an unemployment insurance policy, which means that the attempt to agree an exit policy fails after liberalisation. It enables the government to continue funding its existing social expenditure, and then it's the changing nature of electoral competition in this phase as well.
Maybe this is a kind of natural place to sort of end the conversation. One of the big takeaways for me from this book is, undoubtedly there is some truth to the idea that clientelism, various resource constraints have impacted, you say in the book, rationed perhaps the provision of public goods and social benefits. But at the same time, it is also the case that Indians have engaged in pretty deliberate debates about what an Indian welfare state should look like, right? And I think one of the things your book does is really illuminate those debates and how they have evolved, again, going back from kind of the late colonial period to the present. I wonder if we could just end by kind of thinking about the debates that exist today, right? I mean, is there a debate around the nature and shape welfarism should take today? Because I think, one of the kind of savvy moves of the Modi government, ever since it came to power in 2014, was to kind of claim the sort of welfare agenda, which was, of course, always a central pillar of the Congress parties, but also to lay claim to some of its innovations, whether it is Aadhaar, whether it's cash transfers, right? I mean, this whole architecture, in some sense, was not an idea that they pulled out of thin air. There had been work, there had been thinking, there had been pilots, there had been planning for this. There was a foundation on which it was built. So I just wonder, how do you think about, right, if you were to write that dreaded extra chapter of your book for the next edition, how would you characterize those debates today?
Yeah, I mean, fascinating. And, as I kind of say in the conclusion, really, there's as much continuity as there is change, at the moment. I think the debate around what role the state should play in the economy when it comes to, poverty reduction, how active the state should be. I think that debate really crystallized in the run-up to the 2014 elections, with a very, fierce contestation between those, broadly associated with the UPA model, which believed in a certain form of social policy intervention that supported social rights, welfare as absolutely central to citizenship claims, and sought to empower people to secure their rights of the state, versus a position which held that the state, in fact, needed to step back. And that what was holding capitalism back and what was holding economic growth back in the mid-2010s were welfare interventions. In fact, I think Suhas Palshikar and Casey Suri put this very nicely when they describe, the contest in the 2014 elections having been in part around the welfare-constrained nature of capitalism in that period. And as you say, when Modi came into office, the BJP very quickly jettisoned what had been, I think, quite an anti-welfare platform, if you like, and indeed made welfare their own through all the ways that you've described. But I still think that at heart there is an important ideological distinction between the way in which the BJP thinks about welfare and I don't want to suggest that the rights-based approach represented anything like a hegemonic idea within the Congress party. So let's perhaps divorce them from the political parties which have promoted them at different points. But between a view of state, of a strong state intervention in the economy in order to promote social rights, and of a much more minimalist view of what the state should be doing and where the state should focus its priorities. So we've seen the rather curious coexistence, I think, under the BJP, both of a very prominent form of personalized, branded welfare politics, direct cash transfers, but also very direct denigration, if you like, of what on the right is often derided as a freebies discourse. That political parties essentially bribe voters with freebies in order to win their votes. And I think that in so doing, that there is an attempt to delegitimize the role of the state in providing welfare. So I think that debate is still absolutely, present. And I think, it is a kind of contradiction that the BJP at some point will probably have to grapple with more strongly, because even among their own supporters, we see upper middle class voters, who probably would favour less state intervention in welfare spending and more investment in capital expenditure in order to support economic growth. And of course, a large number of the so-called Labharti beneficiary voters who receive welfare benefits, and we have and also vote for the BJP. Now, I have a paper that I'm just working on at the moment, which is going to tease out some of those contradictions in more detail. So watch this space. But I think there are still very live debates. For all that we think that there's been a real flattening of the way that welfare is done because of the ascendancy of these forms of digitally enabled cash transfer, I think that there is still a very real underlying debate going on.
My guest on the show this week is the scholar Louise Tillin. She is a professor of politics in the King's India Institute at King's College London. She's also the author of a brand new book, Making India Work, The Development of Welfare in a Multi-Level Democracy. Pratap Bhanu Mehta calls it an analytically astute and historically informed account of India's welfare regimes. It's unique in bringing together regional dynamics, electoral competition, social movements, and normative frameworks, and a compelling account of one of the most significant welfare regimes in the world. Louise, I know how long you've been working on this book, because we've talked about it, but it's so wonderful to see it come together. Congrats on the book, and thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you, Milan.
Grand Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show, to support the work we do on Grand Tamasha, and to find the writing we mentioned on this week's episode, visit our website, grandtamasha.com. Tim Martin is our audio engineer. Mira Verghese is our executive producer. Additional assistance is provided by Annabelle Richter. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production, brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.